am Christina Boyd-Smith, the Corporate Rebel Coach, and I am excited to welcome you back to the Corporate Rebel Unplugged. And today I am just so excited because Kathy Lundberg is here. And just for those of you, Kathy Lundberg was my vice president when I worked for Boston Scientific and for Guidant. We went through a lot together as a department, and she is one of the most gracious and generous professionals I've ever had the privilege of working with. And I'm just so excited that you're here, Kathy.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
So I'm going to start by just doing a quick introduction so you have a little bit of background about Kathy, and then we're just going to launch right into our conversation. So with a Bachelor's of Science in Math and a Master's of Science in Biostatistics, already you're very impressive, Kathy. Kathy went from working as a scientist at the University of Minnesota Department of Medicine to a life in a corporate role. Her first corporate job was as a biostatistician in the clinical research department of a med tech company belonging to Eli Lilly. The company had a practice of rotating people through a variety of roles to develop management capabilities, and she had the good fortune to be part of this development. And actually, Kathy, I had the good fortune to be part of that development. That's how I ended up in your department. She held roles in IT, human resources, manufacturing, regulatory affairs, clinical trials, and corporate compliance. The company grew, split from the pharmaceutical parent to become a standalone med tech group, did numerous acquisitions, and was eventually acquired by Boston Scientific. After leaving big corporate life, she worked on the senior teams of several small startups and has continued to consult for small to mid-sized companies. All the rotations and experiences she had with Lilly, Guidant, and Boston Scientific have been instrumental in her work with small organizations and her consulting in general. And I also, Kathy's very modest. And so I just want to put out there that she was the former senior vice president and chief compliance officer of Boston Scientific. She didn't actually include that. You didn't include that in your bio. And I wanted to make sure people know that you were really playing at a very significant level of a major medical device manufacturer.
Because I had a good team of people working with me, so which included you. Thanks to you for all that you did.
Thank you. Very kind of you to say. So let's just start with a very quick, 2-minute romp through your career. And because this is the Corporate Rebel Unplugged, right? It's not a job interview. I would love for you to just highlight some of the unusual turns or risks that you took along your journey.
Sure. Yeah. Well, after getting my master's degree at the point that I had my oral exam, I was about 8 3/4 months pregnant. So I feel like they just kind of finalized it and gave it to me to get me out of the room. I had the good fortune to have opportunities to go to work for a couple different medical device companies at that time, and as a biostat. So I chose the company that was a part of Eli Lilly. And one of several reasons for that was that they had on-site daycare, which was really unusual at that point in time. This is about 29 years ago. And as a biostatistician there, getting my feet on the ground in a corporate world where I hadn't worked before, it was an interesting, fun thing. But before too long, I was approached to ask if I wanted to move to a different role, and one which I didn't know a whole lot about. And I came to understand that that's a wonderful way to develop people and to give them experiences and exposure to other parts of an organization. But it was a real difficult decision for me at the time, because here I was, the expert in something, feeling like I was doing a reasonable job at it, and being asked to move to an area where I knew nothing. And it was so different from anything I had done, which was when I was asked to go into the HR role. And so, of course, I was given a very short time frame to decide. It was a Friday afternoon, and they said, come on back Monday and tell us what your answer is. So over the weekend, talked it over with my husband, and we said, where else can you get a chance to do something completely new, see how it goes, and probably if you're no good at it, you might be able to go back to what you were doing before. So, and that really began the chance to move through lots of different areas, not being the expert when I entered, but trying to understand, how do I learn quickly? How do I get a great team of people around me who are better than me and who we can work together to make things better in this particular group. And so that's kind of the story of how all those different kinds of positions came to be. And I at this point in my life, I think what a great experience I've had, and what a wonderful preparation it was for working for a startup, which is lots of fun.
So I'm curious, actually, going back to this pivotal moment. So how old was your child at that point when you made the decision to move into HR?
So he was about a year and a half old at that point.
So go ahead.
And young in at daycare at that point. So there were some constraints about, I had to be out of the office at about 5:30 at night, or we start paying penalties for late pickup.
Yeah, I'm curious, what enabled you? I mean, I'm just imagining, because I work with lots of people that are at different phases of their careers, and having a 1.5-year-old, being settled in a position where you knew what you were doing, and then pivoting to a completely different role that was outside of your area of expertise. What was the decision-making process, and what enabled you to be courageous in that moment?
I think the feeling that I had accomplished things through college and being able to enter the workforce, and I did get my master's degree while I was working full-time at the university. So the challenge of trying to juggle things was something that I felt that I had done in a way. And so knowing that I'd be taking on something brand new, no experience with this, but the idea that I love to learn about new things, and talking with a couple of people within the organization who expressed to me the belief that I could do it, I really relied on their good judgment and their good faith, and said, well, I will give it a try. And it was more the idea that it was something new and adventurous for me, with the fact that there were things to fall back on. So I didn't feel as though I was completely stepping off a bridge.
Okay. So a sense of, I'm hearing you say there was a sense of adventure, possibility, and also some sense of there's a safety net should you need it. Yes. Yeah.
I think that the company provided that. Companies that do those types of rotations for people, they tend to have good support systems in place to help you get up to speed and learn the area that you're going into.
And I can say that, in my vast experience now with seeing inside lots of different companies, that was a really unusual process to move people out of their area of expertise and into something else.
I think that's right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I don't see that very often. And I know for me, I got pushed kicking and screaming out of HR because I loved it so much. Right. And then I never went back because I got into your organization in compliance, and I loved it even more.
Yeah, I think that is one of the things that I learned too, that areas that I believed I would not like at all. And one example of that was manufacturing. I went from an HR management role to managing a manufacturing operation. And I just thought I was going to hate manufacturing. But at this point, I'd been through a couple of rotations and realized, well, you're going to learn some new things that'll be good for you in the long run. And I ended up loving manufacturing. It was really interesting, had a good boss who coached me and gave me some good insights. And the people that you work with in the manufacturing area are so diligent and hardworking, and I still have friends to this day among some of them.
When you look back at this, sort of amazingly varied career path, what are some of those moments or those lessons that you feel like you learned where you're like, that was a game changer? In hindsight, maybe you couldn't see them in the moment, but now you can say, yep, that was a real game changer.
Well, I think I would point to a couple examples of that. One was the first one with human resources. The person who recruited me to that role, who at the time was the director of HR, And within about 2 weeks of me saying yes and moving into the job, he moved back to Lilly in Indianapolis. So I had a brand new boss, didn't know him at all. And so what I learned from that was how to work with my own team, how to really understand who was good at what, how we should organize ourselves, what kind of goals we should set based on the talents of the team that we had. And for me, that was a wonderful experience, because that is what allowed me to say yes to all the other possibilities that came along, knowing that that was a lesson that would apply whether it was manufacturing or any other job. And then I think the other example that in my overall career that was probably the biggest game changer was the job in regulatory. It's a position that there's really no classroom, there wasn't at the time, that taught you what regulatory affairs was all about. And you learned it on the fly and understood how, had to understand how to work with the FDA. And the person who had handled the clinical area, had been the director of clinicals, left the company shortly after I had moved into the regulatory job. And my boss at the time said, well, why don't you just pick up clinical also?
Great, why not?
Well, okay. And it turned out those two areas just make so much sense to work together, as opposed to working against each other, or kind of, making the other the scapegoat for why they weren't further along. It just made enormous sense. So those are the two real game changers for me in my career.
Well, and I'm just imagining then, as you became, you entered a compliance role and became the chief compliance officer in an organization that really is run entirely by compliance and regulations. I mean, that's really important. That having all this experience and all these windows into all these different parts of the company just made you so ready for that job.
I think that's right. It was really the background in regulatory, but also then knowing how a manufacturing process works for a medical device company that is governed by regulation, and really what it took to get new products through the pipeline and approved and on the market was something that I think for somebody in a compliance role to have that kind of grasp, as opposed to knowing, just knowing what the rules are and saying you have to follow them. It's a way to make it real, to make it personal for different people in different roles within the organization. And the other thing that I give a lot of credit to is networking with peers outside of the organization, groups like AdvaMed, talking with people who have been in roles that you are now in, or are in the same role as you, and kind of comparing what works and what doesn't work.
I'm finding myself really curious, because I get a lot of people who come to me and they're like, I want my 5-year plan, right? I coach MBAs at the University of Minnesota, and they want a plan. They want to know where they're going to be in 5 years, or where they're going to be in 10 years. And given that you can now look back over this really sort of like a career, an enviable career that a lot of people would really want to have, how much do you feel like you planned your next move, or were strategic about what you did, and how much of it was organic and grew around you because of who you were and how you were showing up?
Oh, that's great. I don't think I've ever been asked to put a percentage like that on it. I think maybe 15% of what I did was planful. 85% was the way a corporation almost has to work is they can't guarantee that you're going to move every 18 months or every 24 months. But if you're in a good organization that's growing and you're helping the company to grow and you're doing a great job where you are, that is the time that you get pulled out and asked to take on the next role or a bigger responsibility. So it doesn't feel to me like something you can ask a company to give you the roadmap and tell me when I'm there. It's you work as hard as you can in the job that you're in. And if you're successful and noticed, I think that the piece about planfulness is looking for the opportunities in the areas you might want to go. And just one example of mine was and in fact, it's the only job I said no to, was as a statistician, I saw that the marketing department was spending lots of money having surveys analyzed outside the company. And I said, I can do that. That's not that hard to do. And so I volunteered to take on a couple of those. And within 6 months, they offered me a role in marketing. Which I also had no experience in, and I was pregnant with my second child at the time. So I said, I think this is just not the right time for me to make that kind of a move. It would have required travel, and so I said no to that one. But I did have other opportunities after that.
I love actually that you're sharing a story that that there were times when you actually did say no to an opportunity, because you've said an awful lot of yes, right? Which is what helped to map out the career that you've had. And so, can you just say a little bit more about what made you say no? How did you distinguish that opportunity was a clear no when so many other opportunities had been clear yeses?
Yeah. At the time, it was fairly early in my statistical role in the clinical department, and we had gotten a approval to run a clinical trial. I was gaining lots of good experience there, still feeling a little bit of a novice within the organization, but knew enough to say, I can help do that and save the company some money by running the statistics on these surveys alone. And I did worry about this quite a bit because I had learned that the company does like to move people around. I was approached by the head of that department to take that role, and I did agonize over that decision. But I thought, if I got an opportunity that quickly and an interesting role like that, it's likely not going to be the last time that will happen. So that's kind of where my head was, and being pregnant.
Yeah.
I didn't want to be traveling every week, and so that was a piece of it too. Not the whole thing, but all of those things together made me decide to say no and take a bit of a risk that maybe that's the last time I'd be asked.
I love the faith in your story, right? That you had faith that the opportunity, this wasn't your last opportunity. I mean, I think frequently people make up that story, right? They'll never come again. Yeah. And I'm feeling curious about, okay, so you've alluded to being pregnant, children. So one of the things that I also know in my experience of you is, you've played at a very high level of an organization, right? You really, you were up there in some very intense times. And yet you also have done such an amazing job of maintaining your sense of balance and your sense of your priorities and your family priorities. And so will you talk a little bit about what's your secret? How you've done that, right? What you learned along the way, maybe mistakes you made that were valuable lessons.
Yeah, I do know that I have to be able to have downtime for myself in order to be productive and engaged and do my best work. So I knew that sitting in the office working until 8 or 9 o'clock at night was not going to be good for me in the long term. And one thing I remember saying to myself early on was that some of the things that you need when you get home, like cleaning the house and cooking dinners and those sorts of things, are things that cost money, that eat into finances for the family. But what I told myself was that those are investments in my career. If I spend the money to have somebody else come in and do some of those things for me once in a while, I'm spending money that I didn't really need to spend, but it means I can have a little bit more downtime, spend more time with my kids, go play a game of tennis, and then be ready to go the next day. So once I realized that, I would say that I'd say that about having a massage.
It's an investment.
That's an investment in having a good day tomorrow.
Right, getting my nails done. That's an investment. Right. Weekend at the spa. That's an investment.
That's right. You need that.
Yeah, and I said this in another interview. One of my favorite books is a book called Essentialism by Greg McKeown, and he talks about protecting the asset, right? That you have to protect the asset and the asset is you. And I think that's exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. And you're not going to be on top of your game every single day if you're burning the candle at both ends and you're burned out. So I think a lot of what being a good manager, a good leader is being able to stay calm and being able to assess things with a clear head. And if you know yourself well enough to know what it's going to take you to go into work the next day with a clear head, then you better do that.
So this is a question that I didn't actually send you ahead of time. So hopefully, right, if I'm surprising you, let me know. But I'm feeling curious, like, you have a very clear recipe for success at a very high level of an organization that I think I've seen mirrored in other people, right? That you have to be taking care of yourself. You have to be operating from a clear head in order to make the kinds of decisions that you're making when you're a vice president or a senior vice president within an organization. Who do you think doesn't succeed, right? Because there is a point where people are like, oh, I want to get there, and they don't ever reach that. Like, who isn't succeeding at getting to that level? Like, what are the barriers you think that people are facing in themselves or in their career that isn't having those doors open? Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think I would point to a couple things that could derail you in that. One is trying to do too much yourself, trying to take something new on while keeping every ball in the air that you had before. And I think something that, one of my tips to people would be, yes, volunteer for more, take more things on, but use that as a way to then decide what you can give up. What could somebody else do? What if you were to hire another person, what could they do? And then maybe take on even more. So part of it's this belief that you have to do it all yourself. So I think that's part of the thing that could stop someone. And I think another piece of it is just feeling like you have to dictate the timeline of things. I know in my HR role, I've talked to people who, if they haven't got the next job opportunity coming to them within some made up timeline, then they're unhappy and they're not doing their current job in a way that makes people feel that they're a star. And so I think you just have to, kind of chill a little bit and wait for the organization to be ready, and that always doing the job you're doing right now the best you can while still volunteering. Maybe there are project teams or something that gets you a little more exposure into other areas you might be interested in is something to take on. But in my first example, be able to give up some things, and maybe some things don't need doing to 100%. They're just fine at 80%.
I'm like gasping. What? I can hear the collective gasps around the nation, right? Of like 80%.
Yeah.
So have you ever had doubts, right? Were there ever moments when you were moving through your career where you had a doubt, or you felt like, oh gosh, I can't believe I just did that, or looked back at something and thought that was really crazy?
Yeah. I think that the big doubts always came at the time of making a move into another area,
Mm.
just realizing I am not the expert in this area. I did not know a lot about manufacturing when I made that move. And so those kind of doubts were there. I mean, I also have had times when I've had people 2 levels above me come into my office and yell at me and say, "Why did you do that?" And those are hard times to get through. You can feel terrible, but when you think through why did I make the decision I made, and why did this person not like that, you can either learn, oh, here's something I didn't think about, or I should have asked more questions about this before I did it. And just realizing that if you can learn something from a mistake, while it's hard to do that and to recognize that you weren't successful in this particular project, it keeps you going, and especially if you're somebody who likes learning, that's the one way to think about a failure is what is it that I'm going to learn from this. So those were doubts. There were also some difficult bosses. You and I probably know difficult bosses. I hope I'm not on your list of
Not
that.
at all. But I'm sure we could name some people.
But it's there are times when you have doubts about that, and you just wonder, is this worth it? Am I going to learn anything more here? And is it time to go do something else? But figuring out how to work with somebody day to day that you don't always agree with, and then I remember hearing a lecture one time about you learn something from every boss you have, even the bad ones, and it can be what not to do when you're in a role like that.
Oh, I love your honesty. Thank you, Kathy. And I'm wondering, in every career, every life, right, people have to make trade-offs. And one of the things that I hear a lot in my business is that people are like, well, if I just can go part-time, it's going to be perfect. And if I just earned a little more money, it would be awesome. Or if I just got this role, then I would be happy. And there are trade-offs with every choice. And I think that we sometimes don't look at the trade-offs. And so what trade-offs do you feel like you made in your career that were, carefully chosen, you're glad you made them, and you recognize that you traded for it?
Mm-hmm. I think the idea of being willing to give up something that you feel you're very good at and go to something where you're starting from scratch, to me was a big trade-off, because there weren't a lot of women in my math and statistics classes back when I was going to school. And so I didn't see too many women doing the kinds of things I was doing. And the fact that I made it through those programs and got a job, I was so excited about that and feeling so good about being an expert in something. People looked up to my opinion on statistics, and then to say, well, that's all going to go away now because I'm going to go take a job in HR. And everybody, loves to tell HR people better ways to do things. Sometimes they're right. Yeah. So to me, that was a very big trade-off that I'm so glad I did what I did, because it just taught me how to be able to make those kinds of moves and to create great teams of people around me that were smarter and better and kept the company moving forward. And as you know, we had some great successes and grew very quickly, which made lots of opportunities for lots of people.
Yeah. I think it is abundantly clear to anyone who is listening to this interview and has never met you before why I described you at the beginning as one of the most gracious and generous people I've ever had the privilege of working for. And I think that everyone on our team, I mean, we still keep in touch, right? So we see each other, would say the same thing, right? That you were just such a lovely person to work for. And I'm going to ask you our last question, which is, if you're going to leave one piece of advice for the folks who are listening to this, who are wanting to advance in their careers, are inspired by your stories, and are considering making a change from what they know so well to something different, what's one piece of advice that you just think you want to make sure you say on this call?
And this was something I learned from being in a seminar with a group of people that I didn't know at all. And people had to talk about what they were doing and get to know some of the other people in the class. And there was a man who was probably in his 50s and didn't talk about the role that he had, didn't say, I'm this is my position title, but the way he talked was about how he worked with people to get certain jobs done or goals that the organization had. And it wasn't until the end of the session that you learned he was a senior vice president for Lutheran Brotherhood or some organization like that. And to me, that was just such an impactful lesson to learn that you respected this person. He knew what he was talking about. He was giving credit to lots of people that he worked with. And it wasn't until the very end, he never said, I'm a senior vice president. And so to me, I think, being willing to share the credit for things with your team and with the people who are probably actually doing the work and who are the really smart ones is the best piece of advice I can give. Nobody likes to work for somebody who's not like that. And, I'm sure we can all point to plenty of people we've met along the way who reflect the different side of that story. So that's my one piece of advice. And I have one other little one.
Yeah, please.
Would be look for somebody to mentor you. I never did that. I regret that I never did. I always thought it would be an imposition. And when people ask me about that, I thought, I would love to do that. So don't be shy about it and look for somebody that you can talk to.
That's a great piece of advice. And I also, back to your story about the gentleman at the conference or the workshop that you went to, the other thing I hear in that is he was really representing who he is in the world, the kind of person he is and what he values, kind of deep inside who, his kind of the core of his leadership, as opposed to standing in, this is my role, therefore that makes me an important person.
Exactly.
Right? I just think that's really amazing.
Yeah.
And locks in for me again what I think has been your secret sauce all along is who you are at your core, right?
Yes.
And that's been reflected whether you're being, a mom, or I must say, like probably the best mother-in-law on the planet, right? Probably like the best grandmother ever. In addition to being just such an amazing person to work for.
Well, thank you. Yeah, my goal now is, a number one grandmother.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the Corporate Rebel Unplugged and sharing your journey and just really peeling back the curtain on what it's like at that senior level of leadership within an organization. It's been just delightful to even get to know even some new things about you.
Oh, thanks, Christina. It's been fun to think about this and fun to talk with you again.
Great. Thank you. Hi, Christina here. If you found this video on my website and you would like to be among the first to be notified when new videos come out and new newsletter content is released, there's a link right below this video where you can sign up to receive an email right in your inbox notifying you of new content from the Corporate Rebel Unplugged. And if you have friends or colleagues who you think would enjoy this content as much as you do, just share this link with them and they can sign up too. It's available to everyone. The link is right below the video and anyone can join. Thanks. Bye.